subjects in some way. I looked at some stats before this conversation that kind of support this feeling that I've intuitively had, and it shows that conflict zones across the world have increased by 66% in the last 3 years. In December 2024, the American think tank Atlantic Council asked about 400 global strategists about their thoughts about what's going on in the world. And 65% think that China will invade Taiwan by force within 10 years. About 40% think there'll be a world war in the next 10 years. About 50% think nuclear weapons will be used in the next 10 years. About 45% think Russia and NATO will fight directly. When we look at sort of spending and what's happening there, there's been a huge jump in military spending. There's now 300,000 NATO troops around the world that are on 30-day high alert readiness. 59 states have erupted in war since 2023, which is the greatest number logged in any year since 1946. And world military spending is up by about 10% year over year, which is the highest sum ever recorded by SIPR, making it a full decade of uninterrupted growth in military spending. Things feel tense, and every time I turn on the news, I have a mild sense of anxiety. So I've gathered you three here today to help me as a muggle, as a normal person that doesn't have an understanding, pass through what's going on and hopefully what we can do about this. Benjamin, to start with you, introductions. What's your context and what's the perspective experience you bring to this conversation?
I was born in Iran in 1977. I came to the United States as a refugee under a program that President Carter allowed for Iranians fleeing religious and political persecution. My family came here on that basis. And I basically spent the next 40 some odd years trying to understand why I come from a part of the world that seems to be in sort of continuous conflict and turmoil, and exactly what can be understood about the forces that brought me here. I'm incredibly grateful to be here, and what can be done to basically change, or at least better understand it, to pave a way for change and progress in the future.
What age did you leave Iran, and what was the environment like when you left?
I was just under 3 years old, and it was a few months after. So the Shah had left in December of 79, and then we left a few months after that, around March. Khomeini had just arrived from Paris on a flight in February, basically taking control. And there was still a lot of anarchy and chaos as to exactly what the new regime would look like, what the government would look like. But my parents began to see that there were some, there were definitely mass arrests, there were protests, there were things that were happening that looked like those who were loyal to the monarchy would be targeted, which is, my family was monarchists.
Annie, same question to you. What is the experience context that you bring to this conversation?
I am an author, a journalist, and I write about war and weapons, U.S. national security and secrets. And I'm interested in looking at the very sort of minutia of weapons and weapon systems and the people who use them. I've written 7 books, and all of them deal with war and weapons, and all of them deal with the Pentagon and the CIA specifically. So all of my sources come from those organizations, the military and the intelligence community.
And your last book we talked about last time you came on to this show. What is your last book about, and what sort of journey did you go on to gather the information for that?
So my most recent book is called Nuclear War, A Scenario. And in that book, I take the reader from nuclear launch to nuclear winter, which happens in a period of 72 minutes. And I interview presidential advisors, secretaries of defense, nuclear subforce commander, et cetera, people who are very close to the chain of command, people who have rehearsed making these decisions if they need to be made. And what I learned terrified me. And from the book has been out for over a year now. It's still in hardback. People are reading it in 28 countries around the world. This is a serious edge of peril topic. And I think we're here to talk about that because no time in my life, I think, have we been closer to thinking about this reality than right now.
Andrew, there's a few subjects and words that Annie mentioned there that also cross over in your story, one of them being nuclear war and nuclear weapons. What is your context, and what is the sort of experience and perspective you bring to this? What's your experience?
Yeah, I am a former clandestine CIA intelligence officer, also a decorated wartime veteran from the United States Air Force during our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've lived in this world that we're talking about, this world of conflict, the world of nuclear threats, the world of developing nations and political and military force as a tool to shape democracy, to shape diplomacy. And I'm very excited to get into this topic because I think there are certain areas here that are misunderstood, areas that are over-dramatized, and then areas that are not being spoken about that are very relevant and very compelling.
Wasn't there a period of your life where you were underground and part of that sort of nuclear chain of command that Annie described?
Absolutely. That's where my career started, actually, was with the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Forces of the United States Air Force, overseeing Minuteman III missiles in Montana, armed with 10 nuclear warheads each, understanding the military doctrine, the strategies, the policies for how to execute.
So you were underground with a physical nuclear key?
Correct. Around my neck. And there are, even as we have this conversation now, there are hundreds of U.S. soldiers, hundreds of Russian soldiers that are in very similar positions, and they're not much older than a high school graduate right now.
Many people think we're on the cusp of World War III, but I think you've said in the past that you actually think World War III has already begun in some context.
Yeah, correct. I believe that we are already at the early stages, if not in World War III. The problem is that people seem to think that World War III is going to emulate World War II. The deployment of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons now would look completely different than the deployment of nuclear weapons looked in World War II, if only because we have 9 nuclear-capable countries right now. Not to mention the fact that we have a completely different information landscape. We have a completely different political landscape. We have a whole different landscape for alliances and for treaties. The world is very, very different than it was when World War II broke out.
So you think we're in World War III now, or the early innings of that?
And I think World War III is going to be shaped by what we call proxy war.
What is proxy warfare?
Proxy warfare is when a wealthy nation state funds and trains and arms conflict in a less wealthy state, where there's usually some sort of civil disturbance or civil fight that's already happening. Much of what we've seen in the last 10 years is proxy warfare. Libya, Syria, Yemen. People argue that what we saw, even Afghanistan, Iraq, where the U.S. was involved, was proxy warfare. Israel and Iran is model proxy warfare. Russia and Ukraine are also models for proxy warfare.
So there's someone else funding it, and they're using that nation to do the work for them, essentially.
Exactly right. You use a intermediate nation that's still developing to decrease the capability of your primary target, while you yourself conserve your own troops, your own weapons, and your own civilians against harm.
Benjamin, what's your take on that in terms of us being at the start of the precipice of a world war and it looking like a sort of a different set of weapons, a different way that we'll fight each other, and the internet and digital warfare being a part of that?
I don't think since the beginning of the Cold War, let's go back to 1947 or 48, I don't think we've stopped fighting. I just think we're fighting wars of different kinds. So I think this idea of kinetic warfare is less frequent, especially among the major powers. So Israel and Iran is an example of one of the last few gasps of kinetic warfare. But if you look at the United States and China, United States and Russia, the European powers, NATO, it's less kinetic than it is more through use of information, through technology, through cyber warfare.
What's kinetic?
So kinetic is, when I refer to kinetic, I mean using actual physical means, bombs, missiles, tanks, soldiers, that type of thing. And it's less now, and it's more now moving towards other forms where you can now destabilize a government or a system of government or a society using a server farm and 20 people sitting in a room thousands of miles away. And you don't necessarily need weapons to do that, where information becomes weaponized, where digital tools become weaponized. And that's far different than anything we saw in the 20th century. So I think that the rise of the internet in the beginning late 1990s through the 2000s, we've seen now this become industrialized at scale. And I think the threat comes now from the ability of countries and regimes to destabilize and interfere with others in a way that they simply couldn't do years ago. And now you don't even need to fund it massively to do that. It's basically warfare on the cheap.
Mm-hmm. Before we started recording, I expressed to you that there's a certain tension in the world right now.
Yeah.
Where's that coming from and why, in your perspective?
One of the things that's been evident to us, especially since the 2016 elections here in the United States, is this idea that we live in a post-truth society. And with so much information available to everybody on every platform, through every means and channel, There's now no monopoly on objective truth or fact. And so with that comes the ability to distort, to propagandize, to mislead, to misinform. And people do this to aggregate power, to bring power to themselves. And so when we live in a world where everyone thinks they know everything or they are afraid that they don't know enough, you have a constant state of tension and anxiety. And people are uncertain about their place in society. There's a wealth gap comes into play. And with that, you feel like there's threats or perceived threats or conspiracies around every corner. And this is why I think lies and misinformation and conspiracy theories take hold in times like this, when people are anxious, frightened, uncertain about their place in society, about what's coming next. And that puts us in a very tense state. And very clever people can take advantage of that and manipulate to their benefit. So that, I think, explains why we feel this tension that we do.
The tension is clearly resulting in real changes, because those stats I read out at the start, where there's more nations in conflict now, there's more military funding, more people think we're on the verge of something pretty catastrophic than any time in the last couple of decades. That information which is causing attention is then having a downstream impact, which is conflict is breaking out.
I don't say it's upstream. You have polarization happening within societies, especially in Western societies, where there is no monopoly on the truth or news or information. You have the fragmentation of, let's say, major news sources. Traditionally, you have a few very respected, trusted sources and authorities or figureheads that people would turn to. We don't have that anymore. It's now been diluted to the point that it is almost meaningless. And so you see that social media has contributed to this. And so with that, these divisions, these schisms in society have made major industrial powers like the United States, like let's say the Europeans, more vulnerable to manipulation than ever before. So now if you're an adversary like Russia or China, Iran, North Korea, you can take advantage of the ability to tap into this polarization and play people off against one another, cause division. And that destabilizes democratic societies. And then that in turn enables these countries like Russia and China and others to have more leverage and more influence in the developing world. In the past, it was whoever had the strongest military. Now, you don't necessarily need the strongest military to do it. You just need to have the strongest information army and the willingness to do the dirty things that Western societies don't do anymore, but they used to.
I want to interrupt because I think there's an order of operations here that we're getting at that isn't clear. I would argue that ignorance starts the foundation for the polarization that is then capitalized on through this information warfare landscape. So I say that because I think it's important for us to understand that your statistics are relevant and correct. Those statistics don't come first, they come after. The ignorance kind of comes first, the willing blindness to what's happening in the world. The willingness to just focus in on what your tasks are or what entertains you and let the rest of the world kind of do whatever it's going to do. It's that choice first that then leads to other countries finding an opportunity to manipulate the masses that are no longer informed as to what's happening outside of their world. I don't want to speak for you, but that's kind of how CIA handles clandestine operations when it comes to information security operations, is understanding we're not trying to make an audience ignorant, we're finding an ignorant audience and then giving them messaging to get them to take action.
The difference is, so I would maintain, we've always been ignorant. The difference is now you can actually do something with that ignorance and manipulate it at scale that you couldn't before. So ignorance has always been with us, but before at least people knew where they could go to find what they perceived to be a trusted source. So now that source is gone, that messaging is gone.
That skill is gone.
I have a different take entirely, and I focus on narrative. So I'm really interested in who tells the story and who gets to control the story. And what I watch happening a lot is that the story is controlled for a while and then it gets hijacked over and it's someone else's story. So it's like the end of the spectrum of what you're both saying. And you have the agency working really hard to grab it back. You've got the White House saying, we need to get our stakeholder press, and it's this. So you're running essentially like a kinetic war, a proxy war, and an information war at the same time. And I think that the information is what drives most of this conflict, which is why it's so interesting to me to speak to diplomats, the only people not at this table, right, that are like, because then that's only where I see the hope of kind of like take it down. Because